大家好，欢迎收看全球瞭望，我是郭崇伦。我们今天在政大国际关系研究中心，在这里参加研讨会，中国大陆国际行为与国际规范研讨会的是美国普林斯顿大学的教授，Professor Aaron Freiberg. Professor Freiberg, thank you for taking our interview.
Thank you very much for having me.
Your book, which recently published in Chinese edition, is called A Contest for Supremacy. Was published 3 years ago, but it's still on the mark, mentioning and alarming people that this contest between China and the United States is going to happen and is going to increase its magnitude. But do you believe this kind of contest is inevitable? There are some people argue that it's only temporary, that both sides can find a way to mitigate its differences. What's your thinking right now?
Well, I should mention that the term "a contest for supremacy" is not one that I made up. I borrowed from Lee Kuan Yew, the former leader of Singapore, who used this term to describe the emerging rivalry between the United States and China. So it's not just Americans who see this, or it's not just me that sees it, it's others, including people like Lee Kuan Yew. I don't think that a conflict, a violent conflict between the United States and China is inevitable or indeed likely. I do think competition between the two countries is underway and in fact has been going on for some time. And I think there's reason to believe that that competition will grow more intense in the years immediately ahead. How it will end, no one knows. I think it's possible that it could end with greater cooperation in the long term, but I think it's going to take some time to get there, and that the road to that more peaceful and stable relationship could be quite bumpy.
We have an interview with Professor John Mearsheimer, who is claiming that this conflict is going to happen whatever, and China can never rise peacefully. And your comment on that?
I disagree with Professor Mearsheimer. I think that view is deterministic, and it's materialistic. It's driven simply by a certain view about the structure of international relations and the impact of the structure on the behavior of states. And I simply don't agree that it is inevitable that a rising power like China must necessarily come into conflict with other countries, including the United States. I think, in fact, one of the factors that may influence whether or not that happens is what happens inside China and how China's domestic political system evolves. People like Professor Mearsheimer don't think that domestic politics matters.
They just don't care about they only care about structure.
Exactly, and he would say it doesn't matter whether China is a democracy or a dictatorship, it will inevitably come into conflict with other powers. I don't agree with that.
In terms of security, there's two elements people concerned. One is the capability, one is the intention. We will first start with capability, the economic growth. Do you think that would determine whether China would have a contest with the United States eventually? I mean, what I mean is it seems the China economy is growing very fast and there's no stopping it. While in the meantime, the U.S. economy is suffering from the subprime crisis, and it's on its way to recover. Do you think that would be the key element for determination of supremacy?
Well, I think in the long run, it's China's economic growth that has propelled it to a position now where it is, in many respects, challenging the United States. As you know, China has been growing at very high rates for over 30 years. There's reason to think that China's economy will slow down in the future, and this growth will not be as rapid. But the fact that it's grown as rapidly as it has enabled China's leaders to invest increasing sums in their military capabilities without really imposing a very heavy burden on their population. So China has been engaged for now 2 decades in a very substantial buildup of its military strength, funded by its very rapid economic growth. So that is the driver, I think, of the overall rivalry and competition. I don't think in and of itself the economic growth is problematic for the United States. The United States has benefited too from China's growth and has contributed to China's growth through investment and also through its role as an importer of goods manufactured in China. So I don't think the economic relationship in itself is problematic, but what it enables China to do militarily and to some extent diplomatically is feeding the competition with the United States.
You mentioned military capability, that this kind of economic growth was supported by will support military capability. But you especially mentioned although the U.S. military technology is far advanced than China, there's a particular area China can develop, like anti-access capability, that can prevent U.S. involvement militarily with its ally or in the surrounding areas. Do you think that is something we really should care about, China's capability?
Yes, I think it is a problem. I think China's overall military capabilities continue to lag far behind those of the United States. If you compare the performance of Chinese and American aircraft or ships and so on, the American systems are superior in almost every regard. But China has been following what I think we now see as a quite intelligent strategy, what some American military strategists refer to as an asymmetric approach, using relatively inexpensive weapons like cruise missiles and ballistic missiles with conventional warheads to target the bases and facilities that the United States relies on to project military power into the Asia-Pacific, and now also perhaps to target some of the ships that the United States would use, including aircraft carriers. So China is creating serious challenges to the U.S. ability to maintain its military position in the region through selective investments in key kinds of systems, the so-called anti-access area denial capabilities. And I do think that that is being recognized now as a potential problem for the U.S. and one that requires a response. I don't think that it's impossible for the U.S. to respond to it, but I think if we don't, the viability of the U.S. position in the region, the credibility of American security guarantees to our friends and allies in the region will erode.
There's another thing that mentioned in your book, that some people would argue China's integration of international system, its so-called to become a responsible stakeholder, would help to alleviate this kind of tension. But I'm seeing that there's a different kind of things happening here. One is that when China get in the international organization, they want to turn the organization into something favorable to their own purpose. The second is, if they find that they don't want to obey the rule of game, they just set up something like a parallel system that is happening in terms of like World Bank or IMF system. They set up their own brick bank, so on and so forth. How do you see that?
Well, I agree. I would characterize it in much the same way. I think over the last 20 years and more, China has sought entry into and been included in a wide array of international institutions, including the World Trade Organization. And it's used its participation in those organizations to its benefit. To some extent, it's exploited the rules of those institutions for its own reasons. That doesn't make China unique, but it's done so to a considerable degree. But I think also what's happening is that China is trying not to overturn or to destroy existing institutions, but to build a parallel set of institutions that will put itself at the center. So it is proposed development bank, it's proposed trade agreements, it's proposed multilateral political institutions in the Asia-Pacific region that would exclude or seek to exclude other countries like the United States, and inevitably then, as a result, make China the most powerful player. So I think China wants to take advantage of the existing institutions and norms to the extent that they advance or protect China's interests, but also to develop alternative institutions and norms to advance its interests, even if those are at odds with the interests of other countries.
We just discussed a variety of things, but China will say cry foul. It's like you are accusing China for something China would not intend to do. China only want to prevent that a rising power will get into conflict with the existing power. That's what they call the new type of great power relations.
Right.
How do you characterize this kind of description?
Well, I think it's certainly true that China's leaders want to avoid conflict or confrontation, certainly with the United States. I think they've recognized that they have no interest and nothing to gain from direct confrontation with the U.S., and they've sought to avoid it in various ways, while at the same time advancing their own interests and in certain respects doing things that are meant to weaken the long-term position of the U.S. You mentioned the new type of great power relationship, and this is a slogan that Xi Jinping has advanced and suggested as a way of thinking about the relationship with the United States, as is always the case with these slogans that the Chinese government puts forward. It's important to look at the fine print or the details, and often the details are not immediately evident, and there's a risk or danger sometimes in agreeing to formulations which appear entirely benign, but sometimes carry with them certain costs or risks. So, for example, the new type great power relationship, from a Chinese perspective, is intended to forestall the possibility of a collision with the United States. It's seen as a way of appearing open to improving relations with the U.S. in response to the U.S. pivot and so on. But it's probably also intended to do a number of other things which are less benign. One is to emphasize to other countries in the region that China is now equivalent to the United States, and all other countries, including U.S. treaty allies, are somehow less important.
Right.
So there's a desire to present that image to the world in a way that weakens, potentially, the U.S. alliances. I think there's also a reason to be concerned that, from a Chinese perspective, a new type of great power relationship in which the two powers, as the Chinese like to say, respect each other's core interests, is one in which the United States will go the furthest to accommodate China's interests, in which, as China's leaders now sometimes say, the responsibility lies with the U.S. to make gestures and to demonstrate its sincerity in accommodating China without equivalent obligations being imposed on China.
But some people would say, what's wrong of this by U.S. yielding some space, power space, for this rising power? I mean, everyone don't want war. So if the rising power is going to rise anyway, and if they don't have their legitimate power space, it's bound to have conflict or war with existing power. That's, I think, Professor Hugh White in Australia had argued for that. And so forth, that the U.S. will have to respect somewhat the core interests of China. Do you agree with that?
I do in a general way, but then, again, the details are important. It's a question of what that means. The United States certainly has no interest in preventing China from growing wealthier, stronger, and more influential. In fact, the U.S. has probably done more than any other country in the world to contribute to China's economic growth and the development of its power and influence over the last 30 years. And yes, that does mean making adjustments and adapting and allowing China a greater voice in international institutions and so on. But in some ways, it appears that China wants to change the rules in ways that are not acceptable to the United States or to other countries. And in particular, we see this now with the maritime disputes. That China has its own distinct interpretation of where its maritime boundaries lie. It claims that it has legitimate right to most of the resources and water and land features of the South China Sea, for example, and that it also has the right to acquire those through the use of threats of force and, if necessary, of force. If the United States simply stands back and lets that happen, China will then be in a position to dominate much of the water off its coasts in ways that are contrary to the interests of not only the United States, but all the other countries in the region. So I think the question for the U.S. and for others is, where can we accommodate China, and where do we have to oppose what China is trying to do? And it's clear where, in some cases, where we have to oppose. I think we're looking for ways in which we can be accommodating. But the idea that we simply have to accept China's view of how its region should be run because China's power is growing is incorrect. Now, you mentioned Professor White, and on this issue of accommodation, I think one way of in thinking about what the U.S. and other powers are trying to do is that we're trying to discourage China from pursuing objectives that are contrary to our interests, making it more costly for them to do so, while at the same time leaving open possibilities for them to expand their influence and their interests in ways that are acceptable to others in the system. So it's not that we're trying to contain them or block them, but there are certain things I think we're going to have to resist.
It's interesting how the other countries see this kind of bilateral relation between China and the United States. We'll take a short break. We'll be coming back. 我们等一下再回来继续跟这个教授来做访谈。